Thank you for watching this video, and thank you for your interest in this paper. I'm Jin Chen from National Zhenjiang University, Taiwan. In this video, I will present my research paper, Effects of Economic Substance Act on Offshore Investment Structures and Tax Avoidance. My co-authors are Zhi Wang, Professor of National Zhenjiang University of Business, and also Zhenyu Cai from PwC Financial Advisory Service Company. The background of our paper is related to the milestone event that the OECD released its final BEPS action plans in 2015. The BEPS report addresses the issues that multinational companies have exploited tax loopholes to avoid paying their fair shares of tax, and provides rules and regulations to equip governments to counter the companies' tax avoidance around the world. The BEPS action plan requires companies registered in tax havens to have minimum economic substance in local. The minimum economic substance includes to hire adequate local employees, to maintain local physical premises, and to have substantive income-generating activities in local. These requirements will substantially increase non-tax costs for multinational companies to continue to rely on tax havens. And as a result, a lot of tax havens such as Cayman Islands and British Virgin Islands, started to implement the Economic Substance Act. Hereafter, I will call it ES in about 2019. Therefore, the objective of this paper is to examine whether the implementation of ES will affect companies' overseas investment structures and transaction models, and also to examine whether the ES will reduce companies' tax avoidance. Our samples are selected from Taiwanese companies listed in Taiwan Stock Exchange and Taipei Exchange markets. The sample period covered from 2016 to 2021, and financial data are collected from the TEJ database. In this paper, we address 4 research questions. The first one is to examine whether companies reduce the use of tax haven subs in their overseas investment structures after the ES. Prior research have shown that if companies are required to fully disclose their overseas subs, they will become less willing to rely on tax havens. And since the ES requires greater information transparency for overseas tax haven subs, therefore it may reduce their incentives to continue to rely on tax havens. So our first hypothesis predicts that after the implementation of the ES, companies will be less likely to establish new subs in tax havens, and on the other hand, will be more likely to close their tax haven subs or move them to other non-tax haven areas. Our second research question is to examine whether companies will reduce the tax planning complexity in the layers of their overseas investment structure after the ES. Prior studies have shown that multinational firms often use complex pyramid investment structures to facilitate their related party transactions to engage in tax avoidance through transfer pricing. As the ES required greater information transparency and compliance for transfer pricing transactions, it will increase the cost of tax avoidance through transfer pricing. Therefore, our second hypothesis predicts that after the ES, companies will reduce the number of layers in the overseas pyramid ownership structure. Our third research question is to examine whether companies will use the transaction models involving tax haven subs and hence reduce the revenue accrued in tax haven subs after the ES. The low tax rates in tax havens provide important incentives for multinational firms to shift revenues and income from high tax areas to tax havens. However, the ES have substantially increased non-tax costs for conducting business in tax havens. Therefore, our third hypothesis predicts that after the ES, companies will reduce the revenue to their tax haven subs. And our last research question is to examine whether companies will reduce tax avoidance and increase paying their tax after the ES. So our fourth hypothesis predicts that after the ES, companies will increase their effective tax rates as well as their cash effective tax rates. The first empirical models are 3 logistic regulations to test hypotheses 1A to 1C. The dependent variable H set is an indicator for companies having set up a tax haven subs in the current year. In the H put out is for companies having closed the tax haven subs in the current year. And the H migrate is for companies having relocated the tax haven subs in the current year. The test variable in the regulations are ES, which is an indicator variable for the post-ES period. We also include relevant control variables in the regression models that are suggested in prior literature. The second regression model is to test hypothesis 2. The dependent variable there is the maximum number of holding layers from the parent company to its tax haven subs. The third regression model is to test hypothesis 3. The dependent variable INV rate is the proportionate of firms' consolidated revenues reported in the tax haven subs. And the fourth model are 2 regressions to test hypothesis 4A and 4B. The dependent variable ETR is the company's current effective tax rate. Cash ETR is the company's current effective tax rates. The results of Model 1 show that the coefficient on ES in the H set regression is negative and positive, which supposes H1A and suggests that companies are less likely to set up tax haven subs after the ES. Then the coefficients on ES in H put out and H migrate regulations are significantly positive, supporting H1B and H1C, and suggests that companies are more likely to close tax haven subs or relocate them to the non-tax area after the ES. The results of models 2 and 3 show that the coefficient on ES are significantly negative, consistent with the prediction of H2 and H3. The results suggest that companies reduce the maximum number of layers in their pyramid overseas investment structure, and also reduce the proportion of revenues reported by the tax haven subs after the ES. The result of Model 4 show that the coefficient on ES is negative in the ETR regression, which does not support the H4A. However, the coefficient on ES in the cash ETR regression is significantly positive, which supports H4B and indicates that companies pay higher cash effective tax rates. In conclusion, the empirical findings of this study show that after the implementation of the ES, companies are more likely to shut down their tax haven subs or shift them to a non-tax haven area. And at the same time, they also tend not to set up new subs in tax havens. In addition, the ES has led companies to reduce the number of layers in their overseas investment structures and to use these transaction models involving tax havens as evidenced by the reduction in revenues accrued in their tax haven subs. And finally, the ES has effectively restrained companies from further aggressive tax avoidance activity. These results highlight a significant shift in tax avoidance behavior for companies to operate in a changing global tax environment, where the OECD underscores the importance of tax fairness. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, and hope you find this paper interesting.